So anyhow, in this award-winning book, States and Nature, the Effects of Climate Change on Security, and it's published by Cambridge University Press, one of the top presses. Dr. Busby explains how the combination of state capacity, political exclusion, and international assistance determine the degree to which the impact or impacts of climate change affect security for a country's citizens. I think we all know the scientific consensus is that climate change is real. There are a few climate deniers, but they tend to be dinosaurs. And the effects of climate change do pose serious challenges for human security worldwide. But as Dr. Busby demonstrates in his book, certain states handle these challenges better than others, and I'll let him explain the details of that. The distinguished international jury said of Dr. Busby's work, quote, "The book is creative in its conceptualization of how climate change influences governments and methodical in its marshaling of evidence." And I should note the international jury is only one stage of the review process. When nominated works come in, I send them out for at least 2 external peer reviewers, specialists around the country, around the world, who are really specialists in that area. Then those come back, the department committee winnows those down to about half a dozen. The international jury goes over those throughout the summer, and these are top people at places like Yale or Stanford or Harvard. And then it finally goes to the Presidential Selection Committee, and that is comprised of people like the chair of political science, the dean of arts and sciences, Dr. Ferre is representative of the president's office, and then lay people, at least 3 lay people from the community, because Charlie Grawemeyer was insistent that the award should be something that would be intelligible, that the ideas, presentation should be something that the average layperson could understand. So it's a long process. It takes almost a year, very exacting. Let me say a bit about Dr. Busby, and then I will turn it over to him. He is professor of public affairs at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He's also a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center, a non-resident fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and a senior research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. In 2021-22, he served as senior advisor for climate in the U.S. Department of Defense. And if you're not aware, the Department of Defense used to take climate change seriously. We're not sure about now, but I'm sure Dr. Busby can enlighten us about that. His work focuses on climate change, global health, international advocacy movements, and U.S. foreign policy, and he's been published in many of the top-ranking academic journals. He has 2 earlier books, Moral Movements and Foreign Policy, and AIDS, Drugs for All, Social Movements and Market Transformation, the last co-authored with Ethan Kapstein, and that won the 2014 Don K. Price Award from the American Political Science Association. Dr. Busby was one of the lead researchers on a 5-year project funded by the Department of Defense called Climate Change and African Political Stability, and the principal investigator of another DoD-funded project, Complex Emergencies and Political Stability in Asia. He's also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So a remarkable record of accomplishment, a remarkable book. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Busby. And please do silence your cell phones in the box.
Right. Well, thanks so much for that generous introduction, and delighted to be here at the University of Louisville and to be selected as the award winner of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Advancing World Order. It really is an honor, and so thrilled to be here. So I'm going to talk about the book. As you heard, States and Nature, the Effects of Climate Change on Security. I want to give you a little bit of background of how I kind of fell into this work, talk about the approach of the book, and then walk you through one of the cases in the book, the Myanmar and Bangladesh cases, talk about some implications for policy, and then close with some discussion of new lines of research, and then open it up to questions. In terms of background, I kind of fell into this space accidentally. As you heard, some of my previous work was on transnational advocacy movements. And about 2004, I was finishing up my dissertation at the Brookings Institution as a predoctoral fellow, and one of my colleagues was asked to write a report for then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan about how climate might intersect with security for the UN system, and he asked me to co-author this paper with him. And that changed my professional trajectory thereafter, and I went on to write for both academic and policy audiences on the connections between climate security in a host of different venues. And as you heard, I was part of 2 previous Minerva Initiative funded grants from the US Department of Defense. And so I was an accidental climate and security scholar and have tried to burnish those ideas in my writing over the past 20 years at a time when that field really didn't exist when we first started. And that culminated not only in this book, but in my public service from 2021 to 2023, where I served as a senior climate advisor at the Department of Defense. And among my contributions was to a DoD climate risk analysis, but also integrating climate into the National Defense Strategy. And some of that work survives, at least online, if not in policy, in the current direction of the Department of Defense. Let me walk you through the motivations for this project. There was a critique of an earlier literature on environmental security that the scholar Mark Levy made, and he noted that the earlier generation of environmental security had case studies, single case studies, that was connecting environmental degradation to violent conflict. And he noted that what the field really lacked was paired cases of countries that faced similar exposure to environmental degradation but had very different security outcomes, because that would allow you to understand the scope conditions under which environmental degradation contributes to violent conflict and when it does not. And so he had made this critique, and when the new literature on climate and security emerged in the 2000s, nobody had really taken him up on that methodological observation. And so I thought the field was due for a book that was underpinned by paired cases of countries facing similar environmental exposure but had very different outcomes. So why does climate change lead to negative security outcomes in some countries and not others? That's really the animating question in the book, and I sought to get at that through a series of paired cases from different geographies around the world. So I have cases from Asia, cases from the African continent, and cases from the Middle East, to try to see if there's a synthetic argument that can explain a wide range of cases. And it was a risky bet, and I think it might have paid off, at least by the recognition that I'm receiving today. So I thank you for that, because I wasn't sure if it was going to succeed. I also wanted to push the boundaries of our understanding of security, and I'll say more about that in a second. And again, it's a general argument that maybe applies to a wide range of cases. And what I wanted to do, the newer literature on climate security, a lot of it was quantitative, looking at the correlations between proxies for climate change and security outcomes like violent conflict. But there was less attention to causal mechanisms. So how do you connect the climate hazards to actual security consequences? How is that chain of events actually happen? And so this book seeks to connect the dots, if you will. As I said, they're paired cases. I tried to understand why was there famine after drought in Somalia, but not neighboring Ethiopia? Why was there a civil war in Syria after drought, but not neighboring Lebanon? And why was there severe loss of life in Myanmar after exposure to cyclones, but not neighboring Bangladesh and India? And so those were the kind of animating cases that I decided upon for the book. And what I'll talk about today is the Myanmar-Bangladesh case, to kind of walk you through the logic of how I reached my conclusions. But let me linger for a moment on our understanding of security. We typically think of security risks as armed attacks against the nation by foreign adversaries. But that has a narrow understanding of security as only identified with violent conflict. And In my mind, what distinguishes security problems from normal run-of-the-mill public policy problems is not the intentionality of an attacker to try to do us harm. Rather, it is the severity of the impact. And for this reason, people like me and others have elevated problems like climate change, like pandemics, to be seen as security risks. These are so-called actorless threats that there isn't another actor intentionally trying to do us harm, but there is the risk of catastrophic loss of life from these public policy problems that elevates them from being normal problems to being security risks. So it is not the intentionality of someone trying to do us harm that distinguishes security problems from other problems. It is the severity of impacts. So the argument in brief, I'll say it all together, and then I'll unpack each dimension and then bring them back together. So the argument is a combination of state capacity, political inclusion, and foreign assistance. The first dimension gets at the notion that states with low capacity will have trouble responding to climate hazards. The second, of political inclusion, suggests that states with exclusive political institutions are less likely to want to respond to those hazards or to respond to and help all of their populations. And the third dimension gets at whether states are able to rely upon foreign assistance broadly construed to compensate for domestic state capacity weaknesses. So let me linger on each of those dimensions, because I know that was a lot all in one fell swoop. So what do I mean by state capacity? So states need to be able to offer services to their citizens. So here I think of state capacity as in terms of like infrastructural power. Do states have the ability to prepare for and respond to their society's needs? This gets at their ability to respond, and states vary in those capacities. And this is part of a larger debate. You see some names on here, but I'm not going to linger on them, but can pick those up in the Q&A. The second dimension, if the first dimension gets at their ability to respond, the second dimension of political exclusion gets at their willingness to respond. And you might think, well, why aren't you using something like regime type as another way of thinking about it? Like there's the classic work by Amartya Sen, who notes that there has never been a famine in a functioning democracy. Well, the argument I make in this book is that there are reasonably inclusive political regimes that don't meet the tests for democracies. They are authoritarian regimes, but relatively inclusive, right? So a country like Ethiopia, no one would pretend that they're a democracy, but up until recently, and we can talk about that, they had a reasonably inclusive system, which meant that they were, in the wake of exposure to, say, drought risks, they were willing to respond to all of their citizens' needs, or more or less all of them. And so exclusive political regimes, by contrast, systematically exclude or ignore large segments of their society. And in the book, I talk about the kind of threshold of 20%. If 20% of their population or more is excluded from representation in government, they're seen as having reasonably politically exclusive regimes where, in the wake of hazard exposure, they're less likely to respond to all of their citizens' needs. So we have state capacity, which gets at their ability to respond to climate hazards. We have political inclusion, which gets at their willingness to respond. But the last dimension brings in the notion of foreign assistance. And this includes both overseas development assistance, but it also includes wider humanitarian assistance, which are often not counted in the same sort of data bucket, if you will. And it would also include things like remittances, for example. So countries, both in the lead up to exposure to climate-related risks, but also in their aftermath, can tap international resources to help them prepare for climate risks, but also respond to them. But not all countries are in a position to respond or to receive that foreign assistance. Sometimes they, at their own discretion, will block foreign assistance coming into their country. For example, in the wake of the drought in the sort of 2009-2010 period, Al-Shabaab, the Islamist militia, blocked foreign assistance coming in to Somalia. But it also can be blocked by international parties if that state is an international pariah. So al-Shabaab, at the same time as it was blocking foreign assistance, was also cut off from international assistance from the U.S. government and others under the U.S. Patriot Act, because there were concerns that any aid that would go into Somalia would be diverted to groups supporting terrorism. And so there's variation in countries' ability to tap international resources, both in the lead up to these climate hazard exposures and in their wake. So bringing all the pieces together, there are a range of possibilities. There are worst case scenarios of states with low capacity and high political exclusion who have aid, foreign aid either blocked or if any comes in, it's delivered in a one-sided manner to some groups and not others. And then there are best case scenarios of high capacity states that have reasonably high political inclusion, and if they do get foreign assistance, it's broadly distributed to all social groups. Now, there are a variety of other possibilities of mixed cases, and I have different predictions about what we should expect to see depending on those case codings. But some of the paradigmatic cases in the book meet some of these characteristics of exemplars of worst and better, if not best cases. As I mentioned earlier, I'm also trying to get at the causal pathways connecting the dots between climate exposure and security outcomes. And so I have a variety of causal pathways in the book. Some of them are simpler, right? It starts off with the climate hazard exposure. It leads to societal impacts in terms of loss of life and livelihoods. Communities then will express their concerns and grievances about, come help us, we're at risk, we're either dying or at risk of dying. And at that moment, the governments have the opportunity to respond to those demands, and they bring with it their degree of political inclusion. And at the same time, they can seek to tap international assistance. If those, that sort of combination of factors are favorable, then maybe societal needs are met and it doesn't end up with either a humanitarian emergency or civil or communal conflict. In this particular example, those grievances aren't met, and so the end of the chain is civil or communal conflict. There are more complex diagrams, both in the book, where there are maybe additional steps of like internal migration, like in the Syrian case. There are more truncated steps where it ends with like a humanitarian emergency. But this gets you the idea, the flavor of the sort of causal pathways, and I'm happy to discuss those more in the book. There are other scholars like Thomas Homer Dixon who have more elaborate sort of recursive pathways that are more complex. I've tried to simplify the logic to be maybe a little more accessible, but I'm also recognizing that I'm focused on relatively short-run climate hazard exposure, and that may be a little bit different than more long-lived processes of long-run climate change. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, but that sort of dynamic might lead itself to more complex feedback mechanisms. And you might have some queries and puzzles, but I'll hold those for the Q&A. So let me walk you through the method that I employ in each chapter in the book, and then I'll walk you through the Myanmar and Bangladesh cases to give you a sort of granular feel for what those chapters are like. The first is that I have to compare two countries to each other and to suggest that both face similar hazard exposure, that climate hazards that reasonably could be connected to climate change were severe enough in both cases that large numbers of people could die, or that there would be the risk of conflict ensuing. I also am able in this book to take advantage of within case variation. What I mean by that is some people are old enough in this room to know about the Ethiopia's in the 1980s, for example, which experienced a terrible drought that led to large-scale famine, right? And if you're a music fan like me, you might have watched the Live Aid concerts on TV, right? Freddie Mercury and others performed at this fundraising concert. So this, to try to prevent famine, raise funds to prevent famine in Ethiopia, which at the time, so some 300 to 500,000 people died as a result of that famine. So in other chapters in this book, I look at how Ethiopia changed. So by the 2010s, when there was a similar drought in Ethiopia, hardly anybody died, right? I'm able to do that also in this chapter that I'm going to talk about, because Bangladesh, if you're familiar with the country, at its founding, one of the reasons that it cleaved from Pakistan was because of the failure of the Pakistani government to respond to the 1970 Ebola cyclone, which killed on the order of, again, 300 to 500,000 people. And so now, as we'll see, by the time we get to the 2010s, hardly anybody dies in Bangladesh as a result of exposure to cyclones. So we have I'm able to exploit within case variation. As I said, I need to document that both face similar climate hazards, and then I code the key variables of capacity, inclusion, and foreign assistance to try to get some leverage on differences between the countries. And then, for good measure, because I'm an adequate social scientist, I try to address alternative explanations. So what could explain the differences between these cases, if not my preferred explanation? And I try to be careful and at least give some credence to alternative explanations. So let's start off with the first dimension, and I'm going to walk you through this for the Myanmar and Bangladesh case. I've got to document hazard exposure. I need to connect it to potential security outcomes through impacts on lives and livelihoods to give you a sense that both countries face similar risks. And then, as I mentioned, these climate hazards could be climate change related, but it's difficult given the scientific evidence at the time to say a particular cyclone, for example, in this chapter was attributable to anthropogenic climate change. What I can say, what I mean by that is, was this particular storm caused by human contribution to severe weather? And the science of attribution studies by climate scientists has matured, but it may be, at least at this time period, it's more difficult to say that this particular cyclone was made more likely by climate change. What we can say is that these kinds of severe weather impacts, like the cyclones that I'll be talking about in this chapter, are the kinds of effects we would expect to see with climate change. So whether or not that particular storm itself was caused by climate change, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of the argument. It's if we expect to see in the future more storms of this consequence, how do we think about the relative ability of different countries to prepare for the consequences? Okay, so this is busy. You don't really need to linger too much on this, but I look at a lot of different cyclones. And what I try to do is say, cyclones have a classification in their severity based on a combination of wind speed and storm surge, although that methodology has changed somewhat over time. I wanted to at least select a set of possible cyclones. So I wasn't comparing apples and oranges. I wanted to get all the severe cyclones that could have prospectively killed and damaged societies in a very significant way. And so I look at both the combination of wind speed and storm surge. There's some that had more storm surge than others that were more damaging. There were some that had less, but that's one sort of step of evidence that I provide. The other one that I do, so these are a bunch of different ones. In Myanmar had a bad cyclone in 2008, which we'll talk about. Bangladesh has had a number of cyclones. Most recently, the one I discussed that's sort of in that same time period is Cyclone Siddhar in 2007. There are later ones. India's had similar ones. I'm gonna, for the purposes of time, I won't talk about the India case too much, but I'm happy to in the Q&A. The other thing that I do is try to map that what happens if these storms just happen to fall on unpopulated areas. Then that would still be apples and oranges. And this may be a little like too granular, but I wanted to basically show the direction of the storm tracks and show at the same time that these storms went over highly populated areas. So they could have killed large numbers of people. And so the one on the left is Cyclone Nargis, which goes over a densely populated area in the Irrawaddy Delta. The one on the right is Bangladesh in 2007. And it comes up from the Bay of Bengal and also goes over a highly populated area. And I do that sort of pedantically for a whole bunch of other cyclones that I talk about in the chapter, basically to persuade the reader that these are all comparable cases of high physical exposure, but whether or not they become security outcomes really depends on the variables in question that in the rest of the chapter. So let's talk about impacts. What impacts could they have had, and what were the differential impacts? So the picture on the left is sort of an exemplar in your mind of what you should think about in Myanmar. The picture at right is for a comparable storm in Bangladesh, right? And this is sort of like the picture version of what to take away, and I'll try and unpack what that looks like. Both of these, and there's a lot of text, but I think for purposes, I try and trace that there were severe economic damages from both storms. Right, and there were some 700,000 people made homeless by the 2008 Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. At right, there was some $240 million in damages that Bangladesh faced. But in terms of mortality, the differences were pretty stark. So nearly 140,000 people died in Myanmar, right? And they lost significant numbers of livestock, but the core thing to take away is 140,000 people died in Myanmar. In Bangladesh, some 4,200 people died, right? Which is still a large number, but compared to Myanmar and compared to itself in the past, it's a tremendous improvement. So as I mentioned at Bangladesh's founding, the Ebola cyclone estimates are anywhere from 300 to 500,000 people died even preceding the civil war where Bangladesh broke away from Pakistan, right? Over time, that death toll has reduced, but still as recently as the early 1990s, you had a storm that killed on the order of 140,000 people in Bangladesh. Flash forward, by the time you get to Sidr, anywhere from between 3,300 and 4,200, it's difficult to count, right? And by 2019, hardly anybody's dying. So we have these comparisons between Myanmar and Bangladesh, and we have comparisons between Bangladesh and itself over time. So what's going on? How do we understand this? Well, not surprisingly, I make the case that there are differences in state capacity, political inclusion, and foreign assistance. So let's start with state capacity. So the sort of basic takeaway is that there was limited state capacity to protect or aid citizens in Myanmar, whereas Bangladesh has systematically built state capacity over time. But one of the things that we can do is get at state capacity in a more granular level. So there are a couple of different ways to get at it. The first way is to look at it at the non-granular level, which is just to look at data sets and measures of state capacity. So this is one that dates back to 1984 from the PRS group, which is basically surveys of international investors on a variety of dimensions, and they ask them about what the bureaucratic quality is of that country. And you can see that India, which is the top line, has more bureaucratic quality than either Bangladesh or Myanmar. Myanmar is the bottom line, which up until the early 1990s had basically no bureaucratic quality. Elevates a little bit, but is still less than Bangladesh through this period. But as I said, we can get at this at a more granular level. So we can think about hazard-specific state capacity in terms of what are the functions that a state would need to have to protect its citizens from these particular climate risks. So in terms of cyclone risks, the first thing we have to have is forecasting, to be able to say, storm's coming, right? You have meteorologists who are able to say with some anticipation, storm is projected later this week, get the word out, right? And so in the chapter I walk through, at the time, Myanmar lacked forecasting capability at the time of the Cyclone Nargis, whereas both India and Bangladesh have higher meteorological forecasting capability. By 2018, it was as much as 3 days or 72 hours lead time in Bangladesh. And by 2007, which is a little earlier, it wasn't quite that advanced, but it was still much better than Myanmar. The second dimension is, again, getting the word out, right? And so this is one of the tens of thousands of volunteers that they have in Bangladesh who are able to take those meteorological warnings and go at the community level through loudspeakers to say, storm is coming, get out of harm's way, right? And so Bangladesh has systematically developed these early warning systems, and it's accompanied by other measures like radio programs, there are text messages, there are other ways to get but this gives you sort of a visual representation of what an early warning system looks like. So in the chapter, I mention how Myanmar did not have any early warning systems. They were virtually absent. And so villagers were totally unaware. We knew the cyclone was coming, but only because the wind was very strong. No local authorities ever came to us with information about how serious the storm was. Whereas Bangladesh has had improved efforts over time, recruited more and more volunteers to be able to translate those forecasts into early warning, right? The last dimension that's hazard specific is they've got to go somewhere, right? If you're giving people early warning, where are they intended to go? Well, what Bangladesh invested in was purpose-built cyclone shelters that are sort of buildings on stilts that would allow people, even their livestock, to get out of harm's way, and trying to place more of them and ensure that they're in functional capacity, and ideally ones that don't require them, to cross a river, for example. So having as many of these as possible to accommodate large numbers of people. And in Bangladesh's case, sometimes there are culturally specific ways of having them, different ones based on gender, so that the concerns about sexual violence are diminished. And so you have cyclone shelters. Myanmar basically at the time didn't have any, right? Not only did the country lack a weather radar network that could predict cyclones, it also had no early warning systems, storage shelters, or evacuation plans, right? By 2007, Bangladesh had 1,500 purpose-built shelters, each able to accommodate 5,000 people. They spent billions of dollars in building more of these over time. So you get a sense that there are stark differences between Myanmar and Bangladesh on all three of these dimensions related to state capacity. Okay, let me talk about the second dimension of political exclusion. This cartoon gets at those issues in relief. The response to the cyclone in Myanmar favored some groups over others. In Bangladesh, the state provided aid to all social groups relatively inclusively. That's the takeaway. And so again, I try to go through these records of political representation of different ethnic groups in government. In the lead up to the storm in Myanmar, you had a military government that was kind of quasi-debating a transition to democracy. They were about to hold a referendum related to try to, you had the challenge from the pro-democracy advocate Aung San Suu Kyi that was trying to press for democratization, but at the time you basically had very limited representation of any ethnic groups in government. So there were a number of groups that excluded themselves from political representation at a time. There were a whole bunch of minority tribal ethnic groups that weren't participating in government, and even this figure overstates the degree of participation because the Bamar majority, which constitutes the majority of the population, really didn't have the ability to influence the military regime. So there are ways that we would code this case as highly politically exclusive, whereas in Bangladesh, after independence, groups that were excluded from government or sort of politically irrelevant never constituted more than 11%. So that's at least one sort of broad level indicator of a more politically inclusive society. I look at other data sets like the VDEM data set on social exclusion, which gets at the service provision to different social groups, and I compare the three countries in this case to Denmark, which is often heralded as a highly politically inclusive society. So based on this metric, you would see that Denmark lower is better, and so Denmark is very politically inclusive. India is a little bit, it's better than Myanmar or Bangladesh, but still has reasonably high political exclusion, and neither Bangladesh or Myanmar are considered particularly politically inclusive by this metric. So, depending on what kinds of data you use, there are different indicators. Generally, Myanmar is coded as highly politically exclusive. Bangladesh is a little bit better, but maybe not great, right? The last dimension that's really relevant in this case, where the differences are starker, is reliance on foreign assistance, both in the lead up to these storms and in their aftermath. And so in the wake of the Cyclone Nargis, the political authorities rebuffed foreign assistance. The US military offered 30 times to the U.S. Navy offered multiple times to provide foreign aid, and the Myanmar government was thinking, because they were about to hold this referendum, they were worried that this might be a prelude to an invasion of forced democratization. So they basically rebuffed most foreign assistance efforts, particularly early on, whereas the Bangladesh government, both in the lead up to this hazard event and in its wake, made good use of international assistance, was described as like the Wall Street of international development, was so open to foreign assistance. And it put it to good use to fund all of those things like forecasting, early warning systems, and cyclone shelters. So I go through data in the chapter. Basically, the upshot of graphics like this one is before the cyclone event in 2008, Myanmar hardly got any foreign assistance. There's more in the wake. They temporarily went through a period of quasi-democratization that's since been reversed. So then they became more open for international foreign assistance. But before the storm, in the lead up and in the immediate aftermath, they were not at all open to foreign assistance. And what little did come in was often biased in ways that were delivered to like the friends and family of the military government and commandeered for their purposes. And so I chart some of that in the text. For example, state authorities did not warn the inhabitants despite repeated bulletins from the meteorological department. They note that external emergency assistance was delayed until well after the event. So the authorities had warning, but they did not respond. You had a businessman who went out and looked at the situation in Myanmar and said there were no soldiers or Navy boats over the water and no aid workers in the villages. And so there wasn't a domestic response, and the international response was blocked. So this is pulling all the pieces together of all three dimensions. And that Myanmar's authoritarian regime did not request nor permit significant foreign aid. So the US Navy, they made 15 unsuccessful attempts to receive authorization to deliver aid and ultimately had to depart unsuccessfully. All right, Bangladesh, by contrast, has what we would call a subsistence crisis social contract, which dating back to the original events of its founding, part of the animating ethos of the government was to try to prevent large-scale risks of death from cyclones. Now, they've had setbacks, so obviously in 1991, the failure, but since then, they have made more heroic efforts to protect their societies from these catastrophic risks and been reasonably successful. And they've done so with the help of international foreign assistance, which has enabled them to make those investments. So that painful political crisis, and this is thinking about the experience of 1991, led to a tacit agreement between the new political elite, the impoverished masses, and international aid donors to protect against the worst effects of disasters. So, all right, so that's the story that I tell that I hope is reasonably persuasive, that there are differences, particularly in state capacity and foreign assistance between these two countries, that explains why the cyclone in Myanmar led to catastrophic loss of life, but the preparations aided by international donors in Bangladesh prevented large-scale suffering, which in my mind is a security risk in and of its own right. But there are alternative explanations, right? One of those is that Myanmar didn't have a history of cyclone exposure of this magnitude. And that's true, and I give credence to that, but suggest that they had warning and they had ample time to prepare, and they chose not to. And it raises interesting questions of, had they heeded the warning and allowed in foreign assistance, how many of that 140,000 those lives could have been saved? It's an open question, and it's difficult to answer, right? Let me turn now to policy implications and where my research is headed, and open it up for Q&A. So one of the lessons is that there are possibilities of policy reversals. And so if you followed the Bangladesh case at all in recent years, they've had considerable political turmoil. The previous government had, under Sheikh Hasina, had moved even further away from democratization and become more politically exclusive. And she was ousted after student-led demonstrations. And if you're familiar with the Grameen Bank, the 85-year-old founder, Mohammed Yunus, came in, was of a caretaker government, and shepherded in a democratic transition, which has allowed for new elections to take place, although Sheikh Hasina's party has been banned from participating in those. Nonetheless, it's not clear if the turmoil has affected Bangladesh's preparations for cyclones. It maybe haven't been tested yet, really, to see the effects of it, but it underscores that even in successful cases, there's fragility of these outcomes. As I mentioned, the Ethiopia case is one of the other success stories in my book, and if you're familiar with Ethiopia, in recent years, they've had a renewed civil war as the government has become more politically exclusive in recent years, and so when you had drought really affect the Tigrayan population, which used to run the country, the majority Oromo, led by the current president, both restricted foreign assistance coming in, so you had famine emerge in Tigray, but you also had a civil war emerge. And so the implications of this is that progress can be upended. But the other lesson that comes out of this is that the worst consequences of climate change are not inevitable. That there are things that relatively poor countries can do through investments in state capacity to reduce their vulnerability to climate hazards, to forestall the risk of severe humanitarian emergencies, but also the risks of violent conflict. And that international aid donors, providing a modicum of finance, can support targeted investments in state capacity to help them prepare for the most salient hazards they face. It is, I think, more difficult for outsiders to influence political inclusion. That's really a choice up to local actors. And we can see the efforts by the US, for example, to do forced regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how difficult it is for those external efforts to be sustained and yield fruit. So that leads me to think about if there are external actors that are motivated to care about supporting these different country contexts, what is their theory of state building? How do they understand in fragile state contexts? What is it that they're trying to do? Do they have the appetite to stay the course? Can they help them in ways that allow local leadership to provide public services to their citizens and to all of their citizens? And if they do not have local leadership that has a kind of politically inclusive mindset, what then? The last thing I'd say is my new research has deviated a bit from this focus on the security impacts of physical exposure to climate change to think more about how responses to climate change can be as, if not more significant, in terms of generating security concerns. And so as we're undertaking a clean energy transition of sorts, at least at the global level, if not in the United States at the moment, there's increased contestation over critical minerals and the clean energy transition. So a lot of my new work is in that direction. And so I'm asking and trying to assess what should the US response be, given that China dominates many of the supply chains associated with clean energy technologies. How can that clean energy transition be shaped in a way that is both successful from a decarbonization perspective, because we need a faster transition to away from fossil fuels to clean energy sources, but done so in a way that doesn't exacerbate global tensions between the US and China and other countries. And so that's where my new work is headed, and look forward to your questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Okay, we got quite a bit of time for questions. Andrew has a microphone, so just put your hand up and ask your question.
Thank you so much for this great talk. Your book is super compelling. My question is related to current overall global reductions in international assistance, and how do you foresee that affecting your argument? Are there any cases that you have your eye on? And what is the future in terms of just greater assistance for helping countries build this capacity and respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the international response, even before recent political developments, was always desultory and limited. The aspirations from developing countries for assistance for adaptation to climate impacts was in the hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars even, and the the global response has always been less than. So you had recent efforts to create like a loss and damage fund through the UN climate negotiations. I want to say that the pledges for that funding was on the order of 720 million. There's probably, from the needs of developing countries, it might be missing a zero. And it's not clear if all of that funding will be mobilized in any case. And so the U.S. has been the primary agent of the departure from the foreign assistance space with the destruction of USAID. And that has also given cover for other governments to cut their foreign assistance budgets in Europe. And it's unclear if there are other parties that are willing to step in, particularly on climate adaptation, right? There may be ways, for example, China's sort of moved away from its Belt and Road Initiative, but there's a lot more foreign direct investment from Chinese companies in clean tech, but there's not much in terms of preparing countries to become more climate resilient in terms of foreign assistance or even foreign direct investment. And so I think that, most of my concern about the disruption to foreign assistance, you heard my second book was on AIDS advocacy and the disruption to programs like PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was the single greatest altruistic act by the US government in the last 50 to 100 years. That was set in motion by President Bush, a Republican, that has saved on the order of tens of millions of lives by extending access to drugs for antiretroviral treatment, which isn't a cure for AIDS, but keeps people alive indefinitely. And a lot of the disruptions to U.S. foreign assistance, even if some of the life-saving funds for the drugs have been retained, the wider institutional edifice of USAID has been downgraded, and the support programs like nutrition or other programs to help mothers, for example, have been eliminated. And so the most immediate impact, if you look at these aid trackers, is the projections already of hundreds of thousands of people have died, and tens of millions of people will die because the U.S. has broken its promise to continue to support these efforts over time, and done so in the most irresponsible way of disrupting those services overnight. There always should have been a plan for more local ownership and financing of these schemes, but from one day to the next to basically say, clinics you have to close, doctors and nurses and medical professionals, sorry, we can't pay you anymore. That was the most callous and unfortunate and morally irresponsible act and so the climate perspective, those challenges live on, but this was a previous commitment that had been extended for 20 years that had worked relatively successfully. And if you can't tell, I am extremely passionate about how awful that step was by the current administration, and anybody involved in it should live forever in infamy.
Great talk. Thank you. It seems like most of the security threats you're talking about are intrastate, within the state itself.
Yeah.
Can you speak at all about potential security threats between states as a result of the climate crisis?
Yeah, so most of this literature has focused on internal violence within countries. There has always been a concern about interstate violence, particularly over shared river basins, right? And so there's been modest interest in that space, but most of the findings have suggested, like you think about India, Pakistan, who fought multiple wars, but never over the Indus, because they've had a shared river treaty that the World Bank instantiated in the 1970s. And so despite them having fought wars for other reasons, it's never been over water. Now that's become more difficult and fractious in recent years, and there's the concern, for example, Ethiopia is building the Grand Renaissance Dam on the Nile, so downstream actors like Egypt are worried about supply disruptions, how quickly they're filling the dam. And so there is the concern that in a world of climate change, that our ability to manage shared river basins between countries is more difficult. But there are scholars like Aaron Wolf at Oregon State who basically argued that this is something that the world has been able to handle relatively peacefully. There may be something special about water being essential for life that has motivated actors to share water, albeit unequally, and that we haven't seen the sort of water wars that we might expect to see between countries. That's not to say that those will be successfully handled in the future. So I did a paper in 2017 for the Council on Foreign Relations that looked at what are these risks between countries. I think it has more to do with there are a number of transboundary river basins that lack those kinds of institutional responses like we see along the Indus, or even ones that have them that they're getting creakier. And so as India-Pakistan relations have soured in recent years, the Modi government, for example, has threatened to suspend the agreement on the Indus as a sort of retaliation for wider disputes over, say, Kashmir. So I think it's been an understudied aspect of the sort of IR climate security literature, but there's a reason for it, in part because most of the risks have had to do with the internal dimensions within states. Not to go on too long, but there are other ways in which there are transboundary consequences from migration, for example, and that comes up in my Syria chapter. But I also did a paper recently on Central America where we found that drier and hotter than normal conditions in the 2010s led to significant outmigration out of Central America to the United States even when you take into other account other factors like local violence. And while the movements of people in and of themselves shouldn't be considered a security risk in my mind, that there are ways in which the movements of people can be accommodated with thoughtful immigration policy, there are actors, as we know in this country, who see that the sort of caravan of migrants walking is inherently in and of itself a security risk. And so the securitization of those migration flows is a concern. In a world of climate change, the ability for people to stay where they are and make a go of it becomes more challenging if smallholder agriculture is no longer viable because drought conditions don't allow them to grow crops. And so so there are other ways in which there are security outcomes associated with transborder, climate risks.
In looking at how open a state is to accepting international assistance, you mentioned a number of political factors, like in Myanmar, the possibility of starting a political chain reaction that might end up disadvantaging military elites or something like that. How about factors that you might categorize more as cultural factors than political ones? Would there be cultural factors that might play into how open a society is to accepting international assistance? Would those factors be different in Myanmar and Bangladesh? And what would they be?
So I'll give you another example, which I'm not sure if it's cultural per se, but in India, they didn't rely and haven't relied on much foreign assistance to prepare for cyclones because they have a notion of themselves as being a great power and do not want to rely on foreign assistance, that they think, oh, we can handle this. And they have rejected offers from the international community, not just from the US, but from other parties. And so that's an interesting deviation from, they are both a little wealthier and have taken it upon themselves to say, we've got this. That might be cultural, and there may be other country contexts which are like that. I think the challenging situation is countries like Bangladesh, which didn't necessarily have the resources to be able to do this on their own. If they turn their back on foreign assistance because of cultural reasons, it may be hard to sort of tease that apart and say what's cultural and what's not. Most of the instances that I follow are ones in which, for example, Al-Shabaab is resistant and reluctant to allow foreign assistance in, or Myanmar is reluctant to allow foreign assistance in. Is that a cultural or political? It's hard to disentangle. In maybe more political in both of those instances. There may be other cases that are a bit like that, but the India one is distinct in that their self-image as a great power meant that even though there were offers, they didn't take them up on it, and they were reasonably successful in investing in the same kinds of forecasting early warning systems and cyclone shelters that Bangladesh did, and they put their own resources to good effect.
Thank you for this talk. So I have a couple of questions. So in the beginning of your talk, you alluded to this combination of state capacity, political exclusion or inclusion, and international assistance as shaping mitigation responses.
Yeah.
Now, all of these are governance factors. So how much of an oversimplification would it be to say that well-governed states respond better? And in that view, would climate insecurity be a factor that exposes poor governance as a stress test of sorts?
Right.
So that's the first question. The second question kind of gets at the Myanmar-Bangladesh comparison with this big caveat that I know almost nothing about Myanmar. I'm very shameful to say that. But in general, from what I know about Bangladesh is that they've had persistent problems, maybe not with cyclone, but also with flooding and water security, particularly with the Brahmaputra and the Ganga perennially having floods and so on. So it might not be the same sort of, it might not be the same exposure to cyclones per se, but you still have a greater exposure perhaps. I don't know if it is, but the history suggests that they might have similar, greater exposure to related climate security factors. And so in doing so, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, if that has had an impact on Bangladesh's response, but also about the origins of these institutions that help in this response, because currently what you have in your causal cycle, and you recognize that it is somewhat simplified, is that the government response happens relatively late after bottom-up demand happens. But you could also have climate change and the social impact of climate change being mediated by the existing institutions. So the government response might come up much, much earlier in your causal cycle. So I'll stop here, but I'd be really interested to know what you think about this.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So I guess the combination of the three factors is broadly under the rubric of governance. And what that led me to think about was the initial literature on climate security talked about climate change being a threat multiplier, where climate change on its own doesn't lead to negative security consequences. It combines with other sort of sources of weakness in society. And to me, it was a little undifferentiated, where it was just like bad things go together. And what I wanted to do is to unpack what specific things we should be worried about. And so governance might be an overall rubric, but what are the kinds of specific dynamics of governance that we're worried about? We're worried about, capacity to prepare for specific hazards, capacity broadly, but capacity to prepare for specific hazards. And we're worried about political inclusion, because you might have some political capacity, but if you have a politically exclusive regime, maybe you're offering those services to some groups and not others. Now, the assistance angle obviously gets at both the immediate response, and this sort of gets at your second question, the assistance gets at is there emergency humanitarian assistance that actors would provide in the wake of this hazard exposure. But as I mentioned, a lot of the assistance comes into the country in the lead up, and so at the moment of exposure, the government responds, international actors respond, but there's also all of that preparatory work, which is reflected in that particular moment of their ability and willingness to respond. And so there is that longer time horizon, I think that's at play. And I think you're right to suggest that the state capacity that Bangladesh has invested in for cyclones may not travel to other risks. And I haven't examined flood risks in detail, but it's still possible that they have capacity for cyclones, but not for other risks. Now, some of the other evidence I marshal in the chapter looks at Bangladesh's own self-reports over time about their preparations for disaster risk reduction to international audiences. And I think that they've done a reasonable job in preparing for those risks, but they just face incredibly high hazard exposure, which is a function not only of the physical geography, but also how densely populated the country is. And so they're always going to be facing emergency events, climate change or no, given that reality. And in a world of climate change, just the disruptive capability is going to be higher. And so I'd have to look into more detail to say, like, are they also able to handle floods? I think that they probably have decent capacity in that space, but I haven't looked at it in detail.
So considering green digital initiatives and emissions tracking,
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, do you see these technologies kind of bypassing state level gatekeeping of humanitarian aid to countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my book is avowedly state-centric, but in my previous work, when we were mapping sort of the climate exposure risks and where we thought hotspots of climate security concerns would occur, we noted that the first lines of defense are at the household and community level, and there are ways in which civil society groups can help prepare for climate risks. And on some level, it's not a perfect substitute for state capacity, in that a lot of these extreme weather events that are made worse by climate change often exceed the capacity of local groups to respond. But in the Somalia chapter, I note that there were at least four severe droughts that Somalia faced, only two of which ended in famine in 1992 and in 2008. And there are other periods in which sort of diaspora remittances and civil society groups were able to interdict and provide services in the wake of droughts in a way that they weren't in 2008 when foreign aid was blocked, both by al-Shabaab and by the US government. And so it may be possible, and there may be more cases of civil society actors being able to respond to these emergency events, but I would suggest that in a world of climate change, those capabilities are often overtaxed, and that's why you often need military responses to mobilize and help people in times of need. Like Pakistan had a flood in 2010 that, and they had a more recent one in which a third of the country was underwater at one moment, and so you needed the lift capability of militaries to prevent people from dying and to get services, and that's just something like, your average NGO is not going to have helicopters or other kinds of material equipment to be able to get people the services they need. And that's why the U.S. military often provides humanitarian assistance internationally, because the U.S. has capabilities in this space that other countries don't have. So when the Philippines had Hurricane Haiyan in 2013, the U.S. provided considerable aid resources. And there are other instances like that that maybe not climate related, like after the 2004 Asian tsunami. There are a whole host of incidences in which the U.S. provides those kinds of services. So whether it be domestic militaries or international militaries, they're often called upon in times of need, because those local groups are, the dislocation caused by those hazards is just more than what they can cope with.
Hi, so thank you again for the talk. It was really interesting. I liked the way that you did the case selection and incorporated within case comparisons using like historical backgrounds. I was curious if you could maybe talk about some of the cases that didn't make the cut for your book and which ones might be worth looking at in the future to see if your theory and proposed solution holds.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are other areas that I didn't explore, like Central America. I have done subsequent work on that, and there may be ways in which it's challenging to find countries simultaneously exposed to the same climate risk and then having differential outcomes. So in the Somalia-Ethiopia case, Somalia had the drought in kind of 2009-2010 period. Ethiopia had a drought around that time, but it wasn't as severe, so I picked a later drought in 2015. And so we think about other regions and contexts. Could we compare is the dry corridor of Central America? Are there other countries adjacent, like Costa Rica? Would they have? I can imagine that's a more capable case, but they may not have faced the same physical risks, given that there are differences in microclimate. There are other cases that are a little different that are like farmer-herder violence. It's more about communal conflict in the West African Sahel setting that I think are interesting, whereas the differences may not be at the country level, but might be in terms of, I don't know, village level dynamics, right? And so there could be differences in village level capacity and inclusion that would mirror at a micro level some of the arguments that I make here, but it raises the question about how generalizable is the argument to settings below the level of the state. And then there are other cases that I considered. For example, when I was trying to find, the cases aren't always perfect comparisons. So Syria and Lebanon. Well, Syria had a higher employment in agriculture than Lebanon. I considered Syria and Jordan, but Jordan had even less agricultural employment than Lebanon, so I didn't think that was a good case. Other people have tried to compare Syria to neighboring countries like Turkey or in Iraq, to try to explain why did you get civil war in Syria but not Turkey and Iraq. But both of those countries were already experiencing some forms of civil conflict with the Kurdish problem in Syria and Iraq's ongoing civil war. So I felt that those case comparisons were inadequate. And so it's a really challenging exercise as you kind of think through case comparisons. And there are other kinds of things that are harder to study which get at future risks that have security outcomes, but maybe different from either conflict risks or humanitarian emergencies. And that's the existential challenges facing low-lying island countries in the Pacific, for which climate change will likely lead to their inability to function as sovereign states. And so for them, it's a security risk, but it hasn't happened yet. And so hard to think about. Maybe different dynamics apply to those settings, and it gets at the wider challenge the literature has had, which is mostly focused on short-run climate shocks as opposed to long-lived processes like not a 1 or 2 year drought, but what about a 100-year drought, right? And those are processes that the field of climate security has not yet really come to grips with, but that's like where our future work should go.
So you're in Texas right now.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speculate a bit thinking about the implications of your argument for kind of subnational responses to climate hazard. So I lived in Louisiana right after Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
A lot of folks here in Kentucky have family that experienced the flooding in eastern Kentucky that was catastrophic a couple of years ago now. And, we can think about these same dynamics of exclusion. We can think about the same dynamics of governance and state capacity. And so I wonder, what you might think about in terms of extending the kind of the logic of your argument to think about how, actors below the state level might, kind of respond.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this kind of feeds off the last question on some level. So there are, even in relatively wealthy societies, there are communities that are not fully included in governance or have their needs met. So you can think about, it maybe isn't an accident why the response to Hurricane Katrina was desultory, or the response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which is not a state, but territory of the United States. Now, part of it is maybe function of distance. It's difficult to provide emergency relief, but had Puerto Rico been a state, it's arguable that the U.S. government response would have been different. And so, if you're of a certain age, you might remember that Kanye West, before he went crazy, said George Bush does not care about black people, right? And that was his explanation for why the response to Katrina was so problematic. And so I think it's that there are dynamics of insufficient political inclusion that even advanced industrialized democracies possess, and that will show up systematically in terms of whether certain groups' needs are attended to. And we have to be mindful of that. Yeah.
Hi, thanks again for speaking with us. My question is, you mentioned capacity inclusion and foreign aid, and you also like talk about Bangladesh, how over time, over the hurricanes, less and less deaths have been happening. And my question is what factors do you think drive, internal change amongst states, like to, make the changes, and what kind of pressures from like domestic actors that will cause them to care more per se about climate change and see it as a bigger risk and, invest in their capacities and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. It gets at the sort of searing experiences of previous civil wars. I mean, there's a literature from Charles Tilley about how war made the state. And if you think about the experience of the revolutionary government in Ethiopia and Bangladesh's experience of cleaving from Pakistan, you had part of the animating ethos for both was we want to, even if we're not fully democratic, we were going to have legitimacy with our populace to break from the previous dictatorships of yore, and that becomes the sort of fuel for the legitimation of the new regime. And so it raises a concern of, can you generate an inclusive governance model without crisis, without the precipitating events? Like in Bangladesh's case, that was reinforced by the 1991 cyclone, which basically said, you've got a lot of work to do. If you want to stay in power as a governing regime, you've got to be more attentive to societal needs. And that's why, sometimes these experiences have emerged in other places, like after Civil War, Museveni in Uganda had focused efforts to respond to the AIDS crisis in ways that brought him political legitimacy that he's then hung around from the 1980s onward as an authoritarian, that gives them the ability to maybe stand up a relatively politically inclusive regime, but never make that democratic transition. And I fear that there are fewer instances of that, the sort of internal development of political movements for inclusion outside of the crisis setting, and I worry about that.
Yeah, kind of to come back to that point a little bit. On the one hand, this really gives me a lot of hope that this is a new factor in security decision making, really taking this into account with perhaps the idea to mitigate the threats. Yeah. And then on the flip, and then also maybe, drones dropping in humanitarian aid and some of those things. And then the flip side, I worry about this being the new driver of the military-industrial complex, right, compounded with cybersecurity, AI, and the drag on energy. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
So a couple of things. So when I was at the Department of Defense doesn't really posture or position itself for climate risks. It basically is trying to protect military bases from climate hazards. But when there are persistent wildfires out west, there's some specialized units that are like trained in wildfire fighting, but there's a worry about moral hazard that the military has. And this is not just a theoretical concern, it's one that I experienced where I was trying to integrate climate into potential military posture that says maybe we need dedicated units that are sizable because we're frequently calling on the military more and more to do, say, year-round wildfire fighting. And the Guard is increasingly moved to integrate that into their mindset, but there's a concern that if we include systematic efforts to train and position the military or parts of the military that their job is mainly to respond to domestic humanitarian emergencies, then civilian actors at the state and federal level like FEMA would basically say, well, we don't have to do this because we can just call on the military. And it's always been the military's position that we do defense support of civilian authorities. Or we're, if called upon by the State Department, we will assist internationally. The greater concern now is the current administration would like to basically decapitate FEMA, and you're going to end up in a world in which you actually don't have civilian capabilities, and so then you're going to be in a world in which you're even more reliant upon them. And that is really problematic. The Europeans, there are some dedicated units, for example, in Spain and other places where they think maybe we need some dedicated military members who are trained and prepared to do that kind of work. So that's a concern that I have, that if we undermine civilian capabilities, that we'll be even more reliant upon the military, which is already reluctant to say that this is in our job jar, even though we know it increasingly